ever breathe. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in love to those around me. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me.
Well, good evening. Welcome everybody to our first Monday's webinar for March. If you're new to our first Monday's webinar, it's a place where we gather to talk about some of the practical implications of living faithfully as a Christian in our current circumstances. So started during lockdown when there was so much to talk about, and hey, that's carried on. There's so many issues around at the time that we really need to talk about as Christians, to think about, discern how to live faithfully as Christians with some of the challenging circumstances around us. And so tonight, wow, I mean, we've got a really contextual topic on the table to talk about, and that is the subject of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, the much anticipated vaccine rollout in our country. And just last night, as the president, I can't remember the number, something 70,000 odd people that have been vaccinated already in South Africa. So I know there's a lot of discussion we need to have. There's a lot of questions that you might have on this. Well, you're at exactly the right place. So looking forward to tonight. I've been looking forward to tonight for a long time. And so we've got somebody with us backstage that's going to be sharing with us just, I believe, exactly the right person to guide us tonight. And that is Dr. Garth Jaffet. Now, if you've been at Rosebank for some time, then Garth may not be a stranger to you. I hadn't met Garth until kind of backstage online a few moments ago. But he's was a member at Rosebank for about 19 years before moving to the Cape. So I hadn't met him, but I had known of him because of the organization Heartlines, of which Garth was the founding CEO and still currently CEO of Heartlines, which is a Christian-based NGO that tackles just some of the complex issues in our country and aims to kind of educate people through storying and movies and film and discussions. You might have seen the Beyond the River movie that came out a few years ago, and the What's Your Story program rolled out around the country. Well, that's the work of Heartlines, and Garth is the CEO of Heartlines. So first came across his work there. Then in the beginning of lockdown, a website came up called Church in Action, which was a resource for churches and really for a lot of nonprofits and people in the country around. It's a communication platform around COVID-19. It won an award last year for just being a great channel of communication. So Heartlines started that in partnership with the South African Council of Churches. So became a little familiar with Garth. He did a lot of writing for that platform as well, and most recently wrote on there around the COVID-19 vaccine. Has done a lot of speaking on this subject and has done a lot of writing on it as well. Garth is also, just like a long list of things I could tell you about Garth, but he's a fellow of the World Economic Forum, the African Leadership Initiative, and a senior Ashoka Fellow, and has received the Global Everett Rogers Award for contribution to education entertainment. Also was the founding CEO of Soul City quite a few years ago. And just if that wasn't enough, his very first book, called Like Water is for Fish, was released, just a few weeks ago. As a doctor, Garth has been at the forefront of the vaccine development and its rollout and communication in our country. He's on the Department of Health Advisory Committee on COVID communication. And as I mentioned earlier, written a lot of material, done a lot of talks on the subject. He's married to Jane, who's also a medical doctor working in HIV medicine, has 2 children, Rebecca, who's in second year occupational therapy, so following in the footsteps of her parents, and Lee in grade 11. And that's Dr. Garth Jaffet, everyone. Garth, welcome to our first Monday's webinar. We're so excited to have you with us.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here and to be with so many people who are interested in this topic.
Garth, you're currently living in the Cape, right? You moved there a few years ago or so.
Yeah, I live in the Cape, actually work here. So I'm a nomad, been commuting for almost 10 years. Obviously, lockdown changed all of that. But I'm presently speaking to you from I'm presently speaking to you from our offices in Joburg. So I have as I say, a nomad between the Cape and Joburg.
Nice. Garth, tell us about your new book. I'm intrigued. What's it about?
Well, it's about story. It's about the power of story, and I tell a little bit of my own story in it. And the reason for the weird title is that it comes from a lovely phrase that story is to humans like water is for fish. It surrounds us all the time, and yet we are completely unaware of it. And I just stumbled upon the power of story in my own life, in that it was a series of books that inspired me to do medicine, called The Jungle Doctor when I was 13. And then I started to use story as part of my medical practice, and it's sort of a full circle. So the book, as I say, is a little bit of biographical stuff, but also interview people whose story has been important, including Lee and Irene Robinson are in the.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to reading it, Garth. We're going to get going in a moment, but before I do, guys, all watching on the webinar, if you've been with us before, you kind of know how this works, but if you don't, so there's the opportunity to ask questions. So Garth will speak for a few minutes, and then actually we're going to pause to take 2 rounds of questions. So just have your questions ready. You can ask the questions in the chat. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to post your questions just in the comments or the chat section there. Or if you're watching on Go Live, feel free to post your questions there as well. Or you can also click the link, things being posted, and you can email in your questions to us, and we'll kind of gather them, and with time of Q&A, try to get through as many of those questions as possible. So get those ready. Well, I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to hand over to Garth. Father, thank you for this opportunity we have tonight to really be present in a way with each other, but really asking you, Lord, to speak your truth to us, guard our minds and our thinking and our hearts around this subject, this coronavirus that has done so much in our lives. And Lord, yes, as we think about and as we embrace just this era of vaccinations, would you just guide us, we pray, and through Garth tonight, in Jesus' name, amen. Garth, over to you. I'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Well, evening, everyone. And what I'm going to do this evening is that I'm going to start really by just talking a little bit about vaccines and their history. And then I'm going to start talking a little bit about, obviously, COVID, the COVID vaccine. Where does it come from? How's it been developed? Is it safe? How does it work? How's it given? Who can take it? Who can't? All of the questions that seem to be going around quite naturally at the moment. But I found two very useful short videos, which I'm going to start with, which give us a little bit of history to vaccines, but also a little bit about how they work. And so let's start with those two videos.
Immunity is a natural defense system of the human body. Imagine millions of immune cells, like white blood cells, all on the lookout for specific germs. If they spot something dangerous, like flu, they prepare to fight. When that flu bug enters your body, the white blood cells move in on it. The immune cells arm themselves and then replicate, creating an army of clones. Then they launch powerful germ-killing agents called antibodies, and they tag the germs for disposal. Once the germ is removed, the immune army can disband. But they leave behind memory cells. Their job is to remember the invader and to sound the alarm if it ever appears again. The first time around, it can take at least a week to mount the defense. But next time, the system is prepared. The whole process takes barely a day. It's so fast, we may never have time to even feel sick. A vaccine pre-arms the immune system by sending in a weakened or dead version of the germ, just enough to be recognized. The immune cells mount the defense, and again, you may feel the effect. But because the threat is low, the immune cells quickly disband. However, the all-important memory cells have been created. The immune system's now prepared for the real germ, but without causing full-scale disease.
This is the smallpox virus. It infected the pharaohs, caused a terrible impact on the Greek and Roman empires, and decimated Native American populations. Nothing seemed to stop this lethal plague until the end of the 18th century. At that time, smallpox was a major global endemic disease. Only in Europe, it killed around 400,000 people per year. It didn't differentiate between rich and poor. Even 5 kings were killed. But for some reason, milkmaids and shepherdesses seemed to be immune to the disease. In fact, they were renowned for their beauty because their skins were free of the scars smallpox caused. They were attractive and resistant. But why? That's what the rural doctor Edward Jenner was trying to understand. He knew that milkmaids got small blisters on their hands when they milked cows suffering from cowpox, a mild disease that cattle suffered from, which caused similar lesions to smallpox. And this phenomenon made Jenner think that maybe cowpox and smallpox were related, and that infection with the milder disease would be enough to protect people against the lethal one. As a man of science, he decided to prove it. And to do this, he needed 3 things: cowpox that he extracted from a milkmaid, fresh smallpox from a patient, and a human guinea pig. He chose his gardener's son, an 8-year-old boy called James Phipps. He infected the child with cowpox, waited a couple of months, and injected him with smallpox. And James didn't become ill. He repeated the experiment with other patients with the same results. Jenner was right, even though he didn't fully understand how his remedy worked. The most remarkable thing was that his discoveries were made way before Jacob Henle proposed in 1840 that infectious diseases were caused by germs, a theory demonstrated by Robert Koch. Decades later, Louis Pasteur, inspired by Jenner's experiments, showed that attenuated microbes could be used to prevent diseases, and he proposed the terminus vaccine in his honor. Almost 200 years after Jenner's experiments, and thanks to global vaccination campaigns, in 1980, the World Health Organization announced one of humanity's biggest achievements: the complete eradication of smallpox, the most deadly infectious disease in history.
Well, I hope you found those sort of instructive. I think two things that I want to talk about there. The first being just how the immune system works and why vaccines work. And that first illustration I thought was great, which is ultimately what it's doing is it's training your immune system to recognize a threat. Like the analogy of a sort of boxing trainer who teaches the boxer the moves prior to the opponent coming into the ring. And by the time he's in the ring, he has a good idea how to defeat the opponent. And that's exactly, in a very basic way, how vaccines work. And I think just the history of vaccines is so important because this is not new technology. This has been around, as we saw there, for 200-300 years. And when we get to the safety things, I was just thinking we're quite lucky that Jenner is not around, and that is not how we have developed our vaccines, by just sort of grabbing the local person who works for us or for somebody we know, grabbing their kid and injecting a bit of COVID and seeing what happens. But that is the basic understanding of how vaccines work. And just let us remember that certainly not just smallpox, as was outlined there, but for years and years, all of us and pretty much everybody listening to this webinar will have had one vaccine or another. When we're children, or our children, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, which is whooping cough. If we travel, yellow fever, hepatitis, and more recently, flu vaccines. And a number of people would get the flu vaccine on an annual basis. So the technology behind vaccine development is not new. And so we're using exactly the same methodologies to develop the vaccine against COVID. Now, COVID itself is not a different family of viruses. It's actually one of the same family of viruses that causes the common cold. And we'll get into this thing about why, this has been very quick, the development of these vaccines. But in fact, the research into developing vaccines against the coronaviruses has been going on for quite a long time. And what happened is a lot of research was repurposed. So it didn't start from sort of day one, hey, this is a completely new thing. We've never done this before. We've never seen anything like it. In fact, there was research happening that actually had been going on for years. It was immediately repurposed to deal with COVID-19. And so let's just talk about these various vaccines. So the one sort of family of vaccines are ones that have been around for quite a while, the ones that we're familiar with. that we deal with measles and flu, etc. And they sort of piggyback on the back of another dead virus or are dead viruses themselves that simply do enough to do what that video is showing, which is to get our immune system armed without causing severe illness. So in fact, when you get a vaccine, and even these COVID vaccines, you often feel a little bit fluey for the first sort of 12, 24 hours. And that's because when the body mounts an immune response, you do that. That is the natural reaction of the body. When we're mounting this immune response, feeling slightly sweaty, having a bit of a headache, a sore throat, etc. These are our body's sort of symptoms of the fact that our immune system is actually working. So as I say, there is one family of vaccines that have been developed for the COVID virus. And they are a family which we were going to get, which was the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. And now the one that is being rolled out, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That is based on so-called old technology. But in fact, the companies that have developed it, as I say, actually had started working on similar viruses before this. But the technology about how to develop the vaccine was technology we've used for many, many years and very successfully. The other that you've probably heard of is the so-called mRNA vaccine. The commercial terms that you'll have heard of Pfizer and Moderna. And they currently are not available here, but the Pfizer one will be, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. This is on the surface new technology, but in fact, again, research has been going on into mRNA vaccines for quite a while, and primarily as a way of actually dealing with cancer. The idea is if you can get your immune system to actually recognize cancerous cells, which are your body's own cells, which have gone sort of AWOL, they've gone a little bit crazy and start replicating in strange ways, that a vaccine might actually be a way to deal with this. And the mRNA vaccine uses a technology just to make the body's immune system recognize and begin to create antibodies against either these cancerous cells, or in this case, they've been repurposed for COVID. So those are the sort of two broad sort of areas of vaccine development. The one, yes, is new, which is the mRNA vaccine. The others have been around for a very long time. So the big question that everybody's asking, this, how on earth did we go from identifying the virus sort of at the end of 2019, hence COVID-19, to having vaccines that are already being rolled out in some countries by the end of 2020. So an extraordinarily short period of development. And the answer to that is that all vaccines go through exactly the same process of development. Your common flu vaccines, your measles vaccines, yellow fever, whatever. And that is that they start off by, once the actual germ or virus or whatever has been identified, they develop a vaccine that they think is going to be able to stimulate or an immune response. And they test it out with the virus in laboratory conditions. So it's not in humans. Within the laboratory, they actually see, does this virus actually get impacted or affected by this vaccine? And that's what they call a preclinical trial, i.e. it hasn't actually been tested with humans first. It's simply to see, is there a match here? You've probably heard about these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. So a phase 1 trial is one where literally it's looking at two things, and all the trials are doing two things. Primarily, it's taking healthy people and seeing whether there are any adverse reactions to this vaccine. And that's a phase 1 trial, and that's done with usually 100 or so people. If that proves that it's safe, no adverse affections, and it's effective, but obviously these people are well, they move then to a phase 2 trial, which is now looking more at efficacy and safety. And there they're looking at some people who might have the disease, or they can study them and see, does this group get the disease if they've been immunized, or do they not? And that's usually with about 1,000 people. Then only once that has gone through and it's again been proved safe, i.e. no major adverse reactions, so we would consider things like a headache and a bit of a fever for a day or two not an adverse reaction, but a normal immune response. They only then move to what they would call phase 3 trials, which is the trials that have been happening around the world. And these are very large-scale trials. These are 40 to 60,000 people. And there they divide up the groups into, usually based on age and gender, and possibly socioeconomic condition, and sometimes what people have called comorbidities, things like epilepsy, asthma, diabetes, hypertension. And they would compare a group who have those to the identical group of people, and they would give the one group the live vaccine, and the other group they would give what we call a placebo, which is essentially distilled water. And neither group knows what they've got. So you wouldn't know, well, I had the vaccine or I didn't. And then over a period of sort of 6 months or so, 3 to 6 months, they will follow up those two groups, and they will see, now let's talk about COVID. They would see which of those groups actually contracted COVID, and whether the group that was vaccinated had a lower incidence of infection than the group that was not vaccinated. And then they would look one step further, which is to say, of the group that got the vaccine and perhaps got infected, what number of those people actually got very sick as opposed to mildly sick. And only once it's been through all of those phases, preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, would it be considered to be approved by regulators. And in the United States, it's the FDA. We have our own SAPRA here, which is an equivalent to the FDA, the UK, the European Union. They all have their own bodies. And we come back to this thing, but this has been very quick. And the reason here is for a number of reasons. One is, as I say, we didn't start from ground zero. A lot of the research was happening already and quickly got changed to start focusing on COVID-19. Secondly, usually there's bureaucratic and financial barriers between each phase. You do phase preclinical, you then have to send off a whole lot of papers. They sit on somebody's desk, you then got to raise money for the next round, and so on and so on. And that takes years. What's happened here is because of the fact, A, that this is a serious pandemic, and I hate to say it, but because it's a developed world disease as well as a developing world disease, as opposed to malaria or HIV, no effort has been spared in getting rid of the bureaucratic and financial barriers. Finances has not been a barrier. People have, in the US, they basically told the companies, just whatever money you want, you've got it. And the authorities got rid of all the red tape, and here's the big but, none of those critical steps around safety and what we call efficacy, does it work, were in any way got rid of in this process. So we can say with comfort that the vaccines that this country is going to get, including now the Johnson & Johnson one, and some of you may say in the chat, but the Johnson & Johnson actually hadn't been approved yet. It was still in phase 3 trials. That would be correct. But we already, because we were a phase 3 trial site, were in communication with the FDA in America, and we knew that they were about to authorize it. And that's what actually happened this week. The FDA has approved the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and the AstraZeneca one, which we were going to use, and then it was found to be less effective against our variant, has also been approved. So I think very, very credible regulatory authorities have approved these vaccines for use. The other thing is that, the the other reason we can sort of say they're safe is I heard a very good talk the other day that said, 100 million people have been infected with COVID-19. Of that, at minimum, and I would say it's a big undercount, is at least 2 million have died. In our own country, where we say 50,000 have died, we think that it's probably 3 times that, given the unrecorded deaths. Of the 100 million vaccines that have been given to date, with the vaccines that we will be getting here, there have been no recorded deaths directly related to the vaccines. So 2 million deaths from 100 million infections versus 0 deaths. And yes, you may find odd websites that say that is not true, but I'm afraid the science is there is no good reason to protect the public from that, in my mind. It is just not worth the professional reputations of hundreds of thousands of scientists around the world. So the last thing I'm going to deal with before I pause to take a break for a few questions on what I've talked about is this concept of effectiveness. And you may have heard this concept that this vaccine is 75% or 95% effective, and this vaccine is only 25 or 30% effective. And the key thing here is that what the efficacy or effectiveness statistics are looking at predominantly are, or in fact always, are the so-called mild to moderate infections. So when you hear that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is the one that our healthcare workers are getting at the moment, is between 65 and 70% protective, or 55 and 60, the lots of different things, protective against mild to moderate infection, you think, well, that's not very effective. Well, what they're not saying is that it's 85 or more % effective against getting severely sick and dying. In fact, some studies would say 100%. So even those people who are vaccinated with these vaccines that are saying 75, 80%, even if they contract COVID, they are unlikely, highly unlikely to get very sick or require hospitalization or obviously clearly to die. And so to give you an idea, we consider a vaccine that is 50% effective a good vaccine. These vaccines are extraordinary at this type of efficacy against mild to moderate. The Pfizer vaccine is between 90 and 95% effective. That's the mRNA vaccine. So in terms of these efficacy rates, there have seldom been vaccines that have been more effective than the ones that we're rolling out. To give you an idea, before we pause quickly for questions, what I'm still going to be talking about, so if you're going to ask a question about that, just hold your questions, is about how it's given, how often, what are the side effects, and then one I think lots of people want to know is who's going to get it and when. We'll then talk briefly about, who can get the vaccine. Are there any contraindications? Just talk briefly about sort of theology and vaccines and why, as Christians, we should, I think, be in line and first to get the vaccine. Talk about, if I've already had COVID, should I have the vaccine? How long does it last? And then, if there's time, I will deal as an aside with Ivermectin, which I know some people are very keen to have a discussion around. So that's what's coming up. But if there are any questions I'll take on what I've spoken about up to now, I'll take them now. If there are none, then we'll move on to the next thing. So, Richard, over to you, and let me know if there are any questions you'd like me to answer.
God, thank you. That's been so helpful already. So I have a couple of questions for you. If you're going to address them later, then just let us know, and you can just go straight back to the next part of your presentation, because we really want to get there. So just quickly, can you explain to me and perhaps to others what herd immunity is? Is that going to come up later and as part of vaccinations?
No, let's just deal with that quickly now, Richard. So herd immunity is very much, a virus is basically looking for its next host. Ultimately, that's how it multiplies, it develops. And that's its reason of being. Is it's like any other bacteria or virus, is that I'm there so that it can breed and multiply and then move on to the next person. Herd immunity is what happens when enough people are vaccinated so that cycle gets broken. So if there are 10 of us in the room and 9 of us have been vaccinated and I come in and I've got COVID, the cycle will be broken because there's nobody that I can then infect, and they in turn can't move on to affect the next person. So very clever people, much cleverer than I, do the statistics around how many people we need to sort of break that cycle. And we need something like 70% of our population. Just talking to different people, I'm not sure that we're ever going to get to herd immunity. I don't think that's a huge problem. I think what's more important is that our most vulnerable people, we prevent getting sick and needing hospitalization. So, in most people, this is a mild illness. There are signs that over time it might mutate downwards, i.e. become even milder. But whether we reach herd immunity or not is really not, I don't think, the Holy Grail. I think the Holy Grail is to, in many ways, protect people who are most at risk of becoming very sick. And that's why I think the so-called second phase of vaccination is probably the key in terms of where we need to get to, rather than so-called herd immunity. Although, if one can get there, and certainly some countries want to get there, that is obviously the ideal.
One quick clarity, and then just another related question. So if you've been vaccinated, obviously you're protected, but you also can't carry it and transmit it, can you?
Well, that's the thing that they're not entirely sure of yet, which is that you might get a subclinical infection if you fall into that sort of mild to moderate group, that group of 30% of people who are not completely. So if we say a vaccine is 70% effective, which means you don't get it at all, but then you might fall into that sort of so-called 30% of subclinical infections where you get it, but you're completely unaware you've got it. Then you could become a carrier without having any symptoms. So the reality is that our new way of life is going to be with us for a while post-vaccination.
Okay, well, I want to track back to that later, perhaps if we have time. But on the subject of mutations, so, I mean, the AstraZeneca got pulled because it wasn't effective against our variant. Can you just speak a little bit around the ones we're getting and around the current variants? Now there's a New York variant, I think I heard today or something. So variants down the line, and then also quick comment while you're on mutations around, can it mutate upwards, as in get worse? I like what you said about it mutating downwards. That's encouraging. Can it go the other way?
Okay, so I mean, again, viruses have been around for many hundreds of millions of years, and they've been around by learning to adapt and survive. And clearly, it's a bit like a boxer who moves into the ring and works out that his opponent has worked out his moves and sets up a couple of new moves to take him out. And it's exactly the same with any virus, not just the COVID virus, is that as our immune systems and vaccines and whatever, whether they've been primed by immune system or by a previous virus, sort of get on top of them, they mutate so that they can actually mount a new attack. And so that's what these mutations are about. The good news is that the mutations, for instance, I had COVID in July of last year. And as somebody who's had COVID, even if I was exposed to the new variations, the chances are that there's enough similarity between what I've had and this variation that I probably won't get sicker the second time around. But clearly we want to, where we'd made a vaccine to deal with type A, and now type A plus a little change has come along. We want to try and deal, if you've never been exposed to this virus, we want to try and give you something that will deal with type A plus a little bit of change. And the Oxford-Zeneca vaccine didn't do that. It obviously had been developed for the previous type A, and it hadn't learnt the new moves. And so the Oxford-Zeneca one was tested here and found that it was less effective if you'd never been exposed, like 23 or 30%, I think it was 23% effective. Now, there's a little bit of controversy around that, in that it's still might still be used here because it has got a potential role to play, possibly as part of a combined regimen. Is that you might still use the AstraZeneca as, two different vaccines combined. That's what we're looking at right now. But that's what a variation is. In terms of mutation up, yes, one of the things that happened with this mutation is that it became more virulent, i.e. it became more infectious. The evidence is that it didn't become more deadly. So it seemed as though its variation was much more around making it easier to contract rather than making it any more deadly than the first sort of type A, if you want to call it that.
Thanks, Garth. Maybe one more question just while we're here. A lot of questions coming in, but I think you're going to address a lot of them in the next part around some of the theological issues. But questions coming around the Russian vaccines, so Sputnik and the Sinopharm being approved in Hungary, and your word on how we can trust those. I mean, if they come this way, who knows? But any comment on the other vaccines out there?
Yeah, so the Sputnik vaccine is, again, a traditional vaccine, as is the Sinovac one from the Sputnik one, aptly named, from Russia. And the Sinovac, and there are a couple of Chinese vaccines, are again developed using traditional vaccine technology, not the mRNA technology. Initially, the Sputnik vaccine, there was a lot of skepticism. They were the first out of the gates last year. There was not any peer-reviewed studies. Nothing had been published in journals. The phase 3 results were not widely distributed. And so I certainly wouldn't be in a hurry to take a Sputnik vaccine. About, I think, 3 weeks ago, The Lancet, which is probably one of the world's 3 or 4 leading medical journals, came out with a peer-reviewed article on the phase 3 studies of the Sputnik vaccine. Now, if The Lancet is happy to publish a peer-reviewed article, you can be fairly sure that the science is credible. And that came out with very, very encouraging results around the Sputnik vaccine. And from what I understand, it is possible that we will get the Sputnik vaccine here as part of what they call the COVAX initiative, which is the sort of collective initiative that we will get vaccines from. There isn't yet any peer-reviewed from any reputable scientific or medical journals on the Chinese vaccines. So I would be a little bit more wary about them until such time as there is that sort of evidence.
Thank you, Garth. We'll hand back to you and we'll come in for some more questions in a few minutes.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so just how is it given? I think most people know it's given by injection. Somebody asked me the other day, they saw that President Ramaphosa didn't have, the person giving it didn't have gloves. Was that not a problem? Well, the answer is that there's no blood being taken or given, and so there is no danger. You will be, obviously clean needles will be used, etc. They will be given in both private and public facilities. Right now, the vaccines, the 60,000 vaccines that have been given, are all in public facilities, mainly in academic hospitals, to healthcare workers. Those in the next 2 to 3 weeks will be rapidly rolled out into other clinics and so on. And I think the aim and the hope is that within the next 6 weeks, all our healthcare workers will have had the opportunity to be vaccinated. The good thing about this, and I can tell you from being part of a range of discussions, is that there is very good cooperation between the private and public healthcare sectors. For once, politics is not getting in the way. And the plans are afoot so that the big pharmacy chains, Dis-Chem, Clicks, the smaller chains where there's a nurse that was vaccinating kids, are all being geared up to vaccinate our population. We're also looking at mobile units, and all of them will operate the same. Is that they will, somebody will, you'll go in, you'll get a vaccine, and it will be a small injection in the upper arm. And the common side effects are as a pain on the vaccine site for maybe 24 hours, feels like you've been punched in the arm. Possibly a fever. Again, if we go back to the beginning of this talk, that's about your body mounting an immune response so it can remember it for next time. Those memory cells get created. Possible other things like a headache and maybe feeling a bit sort of sickish. And usually within 24 to 36 hours, those side effects disappear in 99.99% of cases. And there are no other side effects other than the things that you treat with Panado or something like that. Just quickly to say that the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, the big disadvantage to those right now is that they need to be stored in temperatures up to minus 70 degrees C. And obviously in our context, the ability to be able to transport them around the country, your local pharmacy does not have a fridge that can keep something at minus 70. The advantage of the Johnson & Johnson, beyond the fact that it is a single dose, and I forgot to say that, it's a huge advantage, is it's a one-dose vaccine. They are doing trials to see whether it will up its efficacy with 2 doses, but it's been approved in the US as a one-dose vaccine as it is here. That vaccine can be refrigerated at sort of 3-4 degrees, and obviously for our context, that's fantastic. We will be getting up to 11 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and there are plans afoot to create storage facilities that will enable us to store these vaccines at this very, very low temperature. So when will we get the vaccine? Well, at present there are the plans, and again, even the European Union, this is a so-called first world environment. This has been patchy. To give you something of this scale has never been attempted in this country. It is far bigger than voter registration. All I'm saying here is that one can expect that we need to work with government, we need to hold them accountable, but we've also got to be realistic, is that what we are trying to do here is quite extraordinary. Even if we just manage to immunize, as I say, up to that sort of second tier, which we'll discuss in a moment, which are most at-risk people, we're still going to try and immunize between 11 and 12 million people in the next probably 6 to 9 months. So the first group is the healthcare workers, and quite understandably, they are most at risk. And I don't think any of us would say, well, why are they getting the vaccine first? The good news is that is happening as we speak. And I think last count, as we said, around 60,000 has already been immunized. The second group focuses very much on 4 big groups of people, what they call essential workers, the people that are necessary to keep our society functioning, our economy going. They're police, teachers, municipal workers, security people, farmers, food workers. The South African Council of Churches are also lobbying to have you vaccinated, Richard, you'll be glad to know, and your colleagues, but absolutely people who are exposed to large groups of people on an ongoing basis and are critical, as we obviously would argue the church is, to keeping our society functioning. So they are the one group. The second is all people over the age of 60, even those with no what so-called comorbidities. And just to go through those, the key ones are hypertension and uncontrolled diabetes. But anything, your cancers, TB, HIV would also be seen as a comorbidity. Then people who live and work with places where lots of people gather. That would include care homes, old age homes. Controversially, some people would say prisons. I don't think that's controversial. We don't want our prisoners getting ill because they will then overburden our hospital system, and as Christians, we see them as people and as deserving as care as the rest of the population. And then, as I say, people working with large groups of people. And then the last group would be people over the age of 18 who have other comorbidities that would place them especially at risk. And they might be people living with cancer, poorly controlled diabetes, bad TB, HIV, etc. And that will be determined usually by doctors as to who falls into that category. And then finally, it would be the rest of us. It's the rest of the country, right down to the age of 18. And the reason, there are studies already happening around the world about vaccinating people under the age of 18. It's not included in anybody's regimen in the States, in Europe, anywhere else. But the reason for not vaccinating them at the moment is that the levels of sickness or even infection the levels of infection are there, which is why when our young people went off to rage or whatever, they became super spreaders. 1,000 people from Belito got sick without really, a lot of them without knowing it, and spread the disease. But the actual levels of real sickness, being hospitalized and death, are incredibly low, which is why we are not vaccinating that group of people as yet. So can everyone take the COVID vaccine? The answer is pretty much yes. However, there are disclaimers. The one being pregnant women, and the reason for that is that not that there have been shown to be any side effects in those people who didn't know they were pregnant, then got pregnant and were vaccinated, or any other evidence. It's just that we cannot test something like this on pregnant women. It is just not ethical. But your doctor, if you were to be pregnant, but you had real risk factors, other risk factors, would make a case-by-case decision as to whether to vaccinate you or not based on that. And the risks would be weighed against the possible rewards about being vaccinated. Another big question is, I've had COVID, therefore should I be vaccinated? And what we don't know yet is how long those memory cells, the antigens, last for, the antibodies last for. We think that it confers, because this is such a new virus, it confers immunity for quite a long time. But actually, we just don't know. So right now, the common wisdom is, yes, you do get vaccinated again if you've recovered from COVID. So I, thank God, have recovered from COVID, and I will get vaccinated as soon as I am in line to be vaccinated. And the same question is, how long does this last? And the question is, again, we don't know for sure. There's some indications that we may need boosters. Because of the changes in various, only some of us maybe will have boosters based on our vulnerability or risk factors or so-called comorbidities. I'm going to stop there for some more questions, and then if there's time and if people would like me to talk a bit about ivermectin, I will do so.
I think we could go on all night, Garth, but we do have quite a few questions coming in. I think one that's been repeated a few times is the concern, I think, for Christians around the supposed or the use of human fetal tissue in the development of, I think, the Pfizer, and one of the other ones I think was reported to have used that. Is that true? And how would you recommend Christians think about if so?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So basically, most medications that are tested in the lab for the last probably sort of 25, 30, 40 years have been tested on human line cells that were originally taken from fetuses. So not just vaccines, but antibiotics, cancer treatments, etc. So not just the Pfizer vaccine, but in fact, all the vaccines have been tested on a human line cell, which would have been taken at one point from a fetal line of cells up to 30 or 40 years ago, and they just get constantly replicated in the lab. And in fact, the Pope put out a statement about this, because obviously this is very controversial. And the Pope and I would sort of, yeah, I mean, it sounds terrible. I would agree with the Pope, but you know, this is the ethics of it. We could argue, but this is was taken from a fetal line maybe 30-40 years ago. It is not taken from fetal lines in the last year or anything like that. And what it has enabled us to do is to safely test these things and other treatments. I would hasten to add, pretty much any treatment that has been come out over the last 30-40 years have been tested on fetal line cells in the lab. And so certainly the Pope has said, please, as Catholics, you have the permission of the Catholic Church to go ahead and take these vaccines, because the end result is ultimately about coming back to, I don't take this vaccine for myself. And that's a point I wanted to make. I'm not taking this vaccine for myself. I'm taking it for my brother or my sister, because getting vaccinated is a sign of love, not for yourself, but for your community. And so I think the love versus fetal line from 40 years ago, the one outweighs the other in my mind.
Thanks, Garth. Changing tack slightly. You spoke about the trials in the phase 1, 2, and 3 and the side effects. Are concerns around potential long-term side effects that we obviously just will not know? Do you think those concerns are justified?
Look, I think the reality is it would be crazy to say we, absolutely know that there are going to be no side effects or will, be minimal side effects into the future. Clearly, we haven't had enough time to say that with complete conviction. But I think there are two things that we should take into account here. The one is the technology, the vaccine development, the way that this is working, the way that it's working on the body is not completely new. This is, we've been vaccinated against various things for many years. And certainly the more, the ones that we are used to, the benefits far outweigh any potential risks. And that brings me to our second point, which is, I think we've got to look at the risk of not being vaccinated. Because, as much as people are saying, well, only 50,000 people, and let's say it's 3 times that many, 150,000 have died. What we're not looking at is what we would call morbidity, or the impact of actually having got sick from COVID. And I, thank God, I'm a well person. I have no comorbidities. I'm under the age of 60. I'm fit and healthy. I got COVID. It was very mild. But for 6 weeks afterwards, and even longer, I actually thought I would never exercise again. For a period of I couldn't walk out of my front door. So I think what we're needing to look at is not just the number of people getting sick and dying, but also the impact of this disease. It is not a disease to be trifled with. And so the risk factor of the vaccines and possible long-term effects between preventing illness in myself, but more importantly, preventing me being a carrier that might infect somebody else, I don't think the two stack up. I think the vaccine wins hands down any day. So I am, as a doctor and as somebody who's studied this, very happy with the so-called risk profile of this, based on not actually just knowing that this is a disease you don't want to give to anyone, and you certainly don't want to get.
Maybe just a couple of technical questions. I think you could. I'm going to try and consolidate them. Just a couple of people asking questions, Garth, just around particular struggles that they've have. For example, somebody we prayed just a lot for last year developed myasthenia gravis after contracting COVID and asking, can I get it safe for me to get the vaccine? Somebody else asking about another condition. Is there any way that you could advise, generally speaking, people who, besides what you mentioned earlier, that if you mentioned pregnant women basically as the only people at risk so to speak, in getting the vaccine. Are there any other that you're aware of, general medical categories that people have experienced something they should stay away from the vaccine?
No, and I would urge those people to consult, with their doctors. I wouldn't want to make a general statement here. It's a risk-benefit ratio. And even in pregnant women, there it's not just because there is a risk to pregnant women, it's just that we don't know enough about the impact on pregnant women, mainly because it hasn't been studied, because ethically it couldn't be studied. However, anecdotally, there is no risk. I would, urge, I think it has to be in those cases of myasthenia gravis or any other thing, would need to be on a case-by-case basis. But the evidence seems to indicate that there are very few contraindications, except perhaps for some immune-related illnesses, not to be vaccinated.
Okay, God, I think we would like to hear a little bit about ivermectin. I've got a few more questions to ask you as well, but I know there's a couple of people asking about that. If you could maybe comment quickly, if you can, on that, and then we'll stretch this out 10 minutes or so if we can, ask a couple more questions, but certainly chat to us about ivermectin. That'll be helpful.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of controversy around ivermectin and why, if it's so efficacious, have we been so slow at registering it? And there's been a huge amount of passion, and obviously when you're dealing with a disease as serious as COVID, anything that holds out hope then is something that you don't, you hear it's fantastic and it's worked, and now we can't get hold of it and it hasn't been regulated. So what's going on here? So let's just talk a little bit about ivermectin. So ivermectin is a fantastic drug. I think the developer of it actually won a Nobel Prize, but it was not developed for COVID. It was developed initially to deal with sleeping sickness, with river blindness, which mainly occurs in East Africa. And it's also been found to be very effective against severe scabies. Now, in South Africa, we don't have river blindness, and we have not had cases severe enough of scabies that we've needed ivermectin. Hence the fact that it's never been registered in this country, because you develop a drug for a purpose. And so you put it forward to regulators as a manufacturer for that purpose. But obviously, if there's no demand, then it doesn't get put forward for regulation, which is why our health authorities didn't use it. But it also had veterinary uses, which is why the veterinary doctors do actually have it registered for use in certain veterinary conditions. Now, anecdotally, ivermectin has been found to possibly, and I say possibly, do two things. One is to stop the virus from binding with the human cell. So it's been found to be moderately preventive, possibly. It's also been found to be better at modulating the immune response, and so that the actual illness is not as severe. And that has been, first of all, two things. First of all, there's been very small studies, and a lot of it has been anecdotes. People like Richard said, hey, I tried this stuff, and do you know what it did? And right now, there's a lot of studies going on to actually test, what is happening here. But it was never developed for COVID, which is why it hasn't been through any of these studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which is why, in all good conscience, our regulators cannot authorize it for use for an illness that it was never designed for in the first place. Until such time as we can do controlled trials, placebo versus non-placebo, which is happening right now because there's enough evidence to show that this is very exciting. We won't know whether, in fact, the fact that Richard didn't get sick was because of ivermectin or something else. So, to be honest, until that happens, and it seems to be happening very quickly, we just don't know. The other thing is we don't know, because those studies haven't happened, is that we have no idea what dosages are effective. So you'll hear at the moment there's a complete hodgepodge of different regimens of taking ivermectin. And so that in itself is dangerous, because the ivermectin that is available from veterinary companies or through the vet actually has an ingredient in it which in sufficient dosages causes renal disease and renal failure in people. And in fact, there have been admissions to hospital of people who have taken ivermectin who are in renal failure. The other danger to ivermectin is because it is not, as only recently, and as you know, the regulations, there's a lot of black market ivermectin floating around. And a recent study that was done of 6 or 7 different tablets, ivermectin tablets, showed a hodgepodge of ingredients, including blood thinners, antidepressants, antihypertensives, all sitting in these tablets that are being marketed as ivermectin. So I'm excited by ivermectin, but I'm certainly not going to take it until we've got some scientific evidence about its use for this disease, as opposed to for river blindness and scabies.
Thank you. I think I'm so glad that you addressed that. That is exciting. Okay, a couple of more questions, Garth. We'll try to get through them quickly. So first one came through just now, but it was a helpful question. Can companies or any organization insist that their employees get the vaccination? Could there ever be, or the government?
No, so absolutely not. I mean, in the same way that you cannot insist that your children are vaccinated. Is that vaccination is a personal choice. You may, and again, I'm not an ethicist or whatever. There may come situations where, we may say, listen, we're not allowing you onto this flight unless you're vaccinated, or into this restaurant. And there it's your choice. You don't have to go into that restaurant. You don't have to go to that church or whatever. But it is quite possible that although you won't be forced, that it will become something that you may want to consider doing, because it will make movement a whole lot more easy. I would just, as Christians, I am not getting vaccinated for me. I'm fairly sure, particularly as I've had it already, that if I was to get sick again, it would be very mild. I'm being vaccinated so that hopefully I don't get COVID again, so that I don't spread it to people who might get sicker than I do. So this, love each other. Who is my brother? Basically, we all are. And I think it is our Christian duty to get vaccinated, not for ourselves, but for each other.
That seems like I'd love to come back and make sure we close on that note. That's helpful. Maybe just a couple of quick questions, again, some technical ones. Just after you've got the vaccination, after you've been, received the vaccination, is it immediately effective?
No, so indications are that the vaccine sort of improves your immunity over a period of time. And if we go right the way back to that first video around training of your immune cells, mounting an immune response, creating memory cells, etc., that takes at least a week. So I think you're beginning to see some form of immunity developing after the first week, and then it seems to improve, rapidly up to the first month. And the reason that some of these vaccines are doing 2 vaccines is that it's almost like a refresher, a booster, to sort of get things going again. Although thankfully, with the Johnson & Johnson one, it seems that we are getting by with 1 dose. So you are not immune the moment you walk out of there, but give it a month or so and your immunity certainly increases dramatically.
The mRNA vaccines, how do they actually work? Do they manipulate your DNA, is the essence of the question.
So the answer is no, they don't. They don't interfere at all with your DNA. They do create instructions for your immune system to mount an antigen response. So they're almost acting as trainers. So instead of actually putting in a virus and your immune system learning how to create immune response, the mRNA is going in there and almost training your immune system to actually produce a antibody. So it's sending in a training instruction, but it's not a training instruction to your DNA, and it does not interfere with DNA one little bit.
Okay. Two more questions, Garth. One, a little bit of a just casting your mind. You mentioned you made that a passing remark earlier about the way we're doing life at the moment, that's not going to go away anytime soon. Do you talk to us a little bit more about that? What should we expect as people living in South Africa and traveling church? What should we expect in the coming year once the vaccinations have been rolled out to a large extent? When do you see things coming back to a kind of normal? How do you think about the future?
I think that there are certain habits that are going to be things that we probably will continue to live with, and for very good reason. They talk about the absent flu season. There wasn't a spike in flu this season, and one of the key reasons, yes, there was lockdown, but a lot of it was to do with things like sanitation. Flu is a virus that very much is aerosol spread. It's spread by touching surfaces, etc. And the fact that we've been doing the sanitation, you walk into a shopping center or into a church, etc. I suspect that those things are public health things that will stay with us and actually are good as a general defense against a range of different things. The concept of I think that we will get back to hugging each other, particularly with families, with friends. But I think it's going to be difficult to know exactly when. My prayer is that we're looking at some degree of normality happening in the next sort of year or so. But even then, I probably, when I greet you, am probably going to touch my elbow against you rather than my hand. And we'll find those sort of ways of interacting. I suspect that some of these patterns of behavior will sort of remain. And I suspect that for a very long time, I doubt very much whether you'll be on an aircraft without a mask. I suspect, because if it's not this virus, I think we are just so much more attuned to the fact how quickly these things travel. So I certainly believe that, if we manage, please God, to immunize the vulnerable in our population fairly quickly, and hopefully in the next 6 to 9 months, that there will be a lot of normality return. But I doubt whether we'll ever go back to a completely pre-COVID world.
That's interesting. Thanks, Garth. So last question, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. Just circling back to what I've heard you repeat a few times on this webinar. So your primary motivation to people to get, I wouldn't say primary, but a major motivation for people, the large percentage of the population that do not have comorbidities and are under the age of 60, would be, to use your words, out of love for one another. Would you say that would be your main message? And is that something perhaps that organizations like Heartlines will be pushing out? And what do you think is the responsibility of perhaps other organizations in terms of communication to people?
Yeah, I absolutely passionately believe that we should be vaccinated as a token of love for people around us, people we know and people we don't know. God forbid that I, even having had COVID, get it again, but hey, I'm fine. It's subclinical, and I spread it to somebody who is somebody's mother, somebody's cousin, somebody's aunt, who then gets very sick and dies, and it was because of me. And I can tell you, for people who say, listen, only 1% or 2% of people have died, I have, my wife works in a public hospital, has worked in the COVID ward. I have been with her into COVID wards, and I have seen this is not something that you would wish on anyone. And I will do whatever it takes to stop somebody I know or don't know getting sick. And I think as Christians, we have, if we're worried for our own sake that we might get some side effects or what if, Well, that's not the gospel I read. It's a risk, I think, that we all have to take. And as I say, from a medical point of view, I don't think it's a risk more so than a lot of risks that we deal with daily. So I would urge everybody who is wavering around this to actually get a vaccine. And the last thing I can say is that any vaccine that this country gets is going to be, I will be confident that we still have health professionals that are in our regulatory authorities. We will not get any vaccines here that have not been proved to be both safe and effective. And so I will take any vaccine that has been approved by our local authorities.
Well, that's a very encouraging note to end up with, Garth. And we just really appreciate having you and people like you on doing that work for us and giving us this confidence. So thank you so much. I'm encouraged to hear that pastors may get in with some of the first groups of people to get the vaccine. And so if so, I'd be very glad about that and be lining up. But Garth, just thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight. We've had more questions tonight than any other webinar, so this really is something that's on people's minds. And guys out there watching, I know there's a few questions still, quite a few that have come in, and perhaps there are ways that we can still answer those for you. But if we didn't answer your question, just seek advice from your doctor, I would say, especially if it's medically related, or engage with us as pastors or staff, and we'll try to get the information that you require. But Garth, thank you once again for joining us. It was a pleasure to meet you and to hang out a little bit with you. And church, those gathered around watching this, thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight. I hope that it's been helpful, and we'll see you on the weekend or our next First Monday's webinar. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.